Well, I couldn't be more thrilled to get going on today's episode as we are actually in the time. And that's the beauty of for me, spending time with the rabbi is they live out the Bible. And so this week, this Wednesday, is the 9th of Av, which would be this fast that we've been talking about from Zechariah. And in a couple, 3 or 4 different places that we'll mention today. And so it's timely as it can be, but it's also profound as it can be, not just in reading of the scriptures, but in living in today, like today. Here it comes this week. And there's stuff that we're talking about in Isaiah 40, and it's going to be in a wonderful episode. So I can hardly wait. Rabbi, jump on in.
Okay, so we were discussing Zechariah chapter 8 from a whole lot of different perspectives, like an extraordinary, multifaceted gemstone, and every which way you hold it, you see something entirely different colors, different facets, different everything. So inevitably, we revisit Zechariah chapter 8 again, and a little bit of a different nuance, a different perspective, a different facet. This is, after all, the Word of God, so we expect it to be multifaceted. There's so many different ways we can view it, and so many different take-homes that we derive from it. And of course, on the most basic plane, Zechariah is speaking to his contemporaries. But he's speaking to each and every one of us as well. If it wouldn't be that way, then Zechariah would have made the cut into the Bible. It's precisely because there is a message for every generation.
Oh, yes.
And what we were just discussing is a theme that reasserts itself over and over in Zechariah chapter 8. And that's the theme of truth. That is the obvious first place to note this is when we read the words of consolation at the beginning of chapter 8. In verse 3, thus says the Lord, I have returned to Zion and will dwell in the midst of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem will be called the city of truth. The city of the truth, the mountain of the Lord of hosts, the holy mountain. And you're part of the complexity when we read these words is, I think we've touched on this in the past. Is this eschatological? Is it talking about the future to come? Or is it coming to refer right then and there to what's happening in the time of Zechariah? He's speaking to his contemporaries. And of course, inevitably the answer is yes.
I saw that one coming. Yeah.
Because he is speaking to his contemporaries. And I know we've discussed this, and this is something that each time it tears my heart out anew. We saw this also as a theme in Zechariah chapter 2. It's also a recurrent theme in the prophecy of Haggai, that God says, I will indwell in the midst of Jerusalem. The Hebrew is v'shachanti, which of course is the verb declination of Shekhinah, God's presence. And that was what was to have been at the time. If we would have also been indwelling in Jerusalem, there was a summons. It's time to come home. Some came. Many, most, at the time, did not. And so these promises were only partially fulfilled, but not in their entirety. So there was this designation that Jerusalem is going to be called the city of truth, then and there. But it didn't happen.
So I have a really peculiar question. And I have been studying the incident in First Samuel. I think it's first chapter 21, where David comes and eats the showbread with his compadres, and his argument to the priest would appear. But I would love to hear your interpretation of this. That, because he's talking to, and I'll probably get these names wrong, but Ahimelech, I believe, was the high priest.
Ahimelech.
And he was the high priest at the time, and his men had been running from Saul. And he comes and tells Ahimelech something that doesn't appear to be the truth, that he...
Oh, definitely. He was unequivocally dissembling. No two ways of looking at it. And he says he was sent by the king. And he wasn't sent by the king, he was fleeing from the king.
Right. So then he says, give me some bread. The priest says, the only bread we have here is this consecrated bread that we refer to as the showbread. And then David makes this comment along the lines of, the men have kept themselves from women.
Well, there was a specific question that Ahimelech asks him.
Right.
And that is, are you in a state of ritual purity? Because if this is consecrated food from the temple, then you're not allowed to eat it if you aren't in a state of purity. And engaging in conjugal relations would confer, I think we've discussed this, a level of defilement that needs to be ameliorated through immersion, whatever. But as a result, it is relevant to the discussion that they were not engaged in any conjugal relations. They are in a state of purity.
Right. And then what David says is that bread, it says the men, it almost seemed like what he's saying is because the men are in a state of purity, that the bread, in its own way, since it no longer was in the Lord's presence, it had been taken down, that when they take that bread in, that bread would then be consecrated because the people themselves were holy. Is that anywhere close to what? And the reason that's relative to what we're talking about here in Jerusalem is meaning that here are these holy vessels, because that's kind of what they refer to themselves as, holy vessels. And so if all these Jews had come back to Jerusalem, then there was a vessel in order to receive right?
That certainly is true. Again, the idea of consecrated vessels with respect to people, and of course, on some level, we are all summoned to make ourselves into consecrated vessels to receive God's Spirit, as we've discussed in the prophecy of Joel. God is pouring out his Spirit upon all flesh, but we need to prepare the vessels in order to receive that Spirit. Otherwise, we end up with a puddle on the ground. So there certainly is that aspect. I don't see it as a matter of consecrated vessels with respect to the men who are with David, but it's...
But then this is a question I have. Very interested in your opinion. Why did David say that the bread would then be common? Or he makes some comment, again, in Hebrew it reads differently, but he's making a reference to the men are pure. This bread then is for the men, and I'm curious as to your interpretation of what David was actually saying.
So I think you are referring to David's statement that the vessels of the young men are kodesh, they are consecrated, even though the journey was one that was mundane. I think that's probably the most rigorous way of rendering it. The idea expressed here is simply that there are rules for maintaining a state of ritual purity when one is going to, for example, be coming into the consecrated precincts of the temple or partaking of consecrated food of the temple. And if one is in a derech chol, that is to translate that rigorously, I guess I would say a mundane pathway. In other words, circumstances that did not in and of themselves require maintaining this high standard of purity. You could still maintain it as a kind of votive act. So that's what he's saying. In other words, that even though we are on a mundane route, we are not engaging in consecrated things, still the vessels of the men are in this state of consecration. In other words, that the fact that we aren't a priori engaged in some kind of consecrated sacred mission does not mean that we are in a state of defilement, because we maintain that level of purity regardless.
And as the case was, that the priest gave him the bread. And the regulation would normally be, right, that only priests would eat that bread. How do you feel like that happened? Well, it just seems.
Okay, so first of all, the dimension that is enunciated by Achimelech in terms of the food that is available is the bread is consecrated. That doesn't necessarily mean it is the showbread that is placed in 12 loaves upon the golden table in the sanctuary that means that they are designated exclusively for the consumption of the priests. That is, consecrated bread could be consecrated from any of the offerings, including offerings of which non-priests are allowed to partake. Just they have to be in a state of ritual purity in order to be able to do so. So that's one stratum that unequivocally is a possibility. Another stratum is the question of being in mortal danger. Now, David doesn't explain what the circumstances of the mortal danger are, because he presents himself as if he is on a secret mission that the king has bidden him to execute. He could be in mortal danger because of that secret mission. Of course, we know he was in mortal danger because the king wanted to kill him. But we have a cardinal principle with respect to when there is endangerment of human life, that except for really extraordinary circumstances, all of the laws of the Torah, not maybe, must be abrogated in order to save a life. So if
is that actually in the Torah somewhere, or is that a
so this is something that we derive from a verse in Leviticus chapter 18. Obviously, we can understand the plain meaning of the verse on a more mundane plane, but nonetheless, the manner in which we understand the generality of the statement in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 5, with respect to the commandments of God, to read it rigorously. You shall keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man does, he shall live through them. I am the Lord. So you could probably anticipate where this is heading.
right?
That you're supposed to do these commandments to live through them, not to die through them. So if there is a circumstance in which the result of keeping the commandments of the Lord will be death, I'm not going to tell you there aren't situations in which there is not merely a possibility, but an imperative of martyrdom, of giving one's life in sanctification of God's name. But those circumstances are limited. And if those circumstances do not present themselves, then one is obligated. If someone, take an example, one of the classic example, a person is in a life-threatening situation on the Sabbath. Is it permissible to violate the Sabbath in order to save that life? And of course, the answer should be clear here. It's not permissible. It is obligatory. Taking a situation that isn't at all far-fetched or infrequent. The Day of Atonement comes, and there is a Torah imperative to fast on the Day of Atonement, and someone is in a debilitated state, and that fast will put him in mortal danger. Is he obligated to fast? He's obligated to eat. He's not allowed to fast. To live through them is an imperative, not a prerogative. So, of course, to that extent, then, if there would be a situation in which David and his men would be in mortal danger because they don't have anything to eat and they need food because otherwise they'll starve.
That's extremely helpful. That really helps me in a lot of different things. I am so glad you pointed that out, and I fortunately highlighted it in my Bible. Go back and look at it. That's
this is a fraught issue, in particular, because the books of the Maccabees, which are not part of the biblical canon, I know they're not part of the biblical canon for you or for me. I think there are some Orthodox denominations in the Orthodox Church, not Orthodox Jews, for whom they are.
About Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, yeah,
right.
American Orthodox, and some Catholics.
But now, one of the themes that we encounter in the books of the Maccabees is that when the Jews would be attacked by the Greeks on the Sabbath, they wouldn't defend themselves. And of course, it didn't take too long for the Greeks to capitalize on this weakness. And it's important for us to emphasize that while that conduct on the part of the Jews was self-sacrifice to the ultimate degree, it was an error. There are those who regard it as permissible under circumstances of this sort to be stringent with oneself. But in general, if there's a war and there's mortal peril, then there's an obligation to fight. So we see that there was something of a struggle with this issue that we find in the period of the Maccabees. But certainly as normative Torah observance, it is an imperative to abrogate the commandments in almost all instances. We can talk about the exceptions, but I think it'll take us a little bit too far afield. But it's an obligation in order to save lives.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, again, getting back to Zechariah and the fast that's coming our way,
Okay.
undoubtedly, had those people been there, there was a possibility to have that presence of God, which we desperately need.
Sure.
And to me, when you say the city of truth, that in of itself, truth in Hebrew is such a spectacular word compared to, there's no comparison in my world when I look at emet versus the English word truth. And so the fact that Jerusalem is emet is truly a spectacular concept, right?
But inevitably, in order to appreciate what that idea of Jerusalem being called the city of truth signifies, we need first and foremost to consider the implications of the context. That is, it is precisely a reflection of God indwelling in Jerusalem that makes Jerusalem the city of truth. And of course, inevitably, in our considering what underlies that principle, we can't help but focus upon the implications of Jeremiah, chapter 10, verse 10. God, the Lord, is truth. Now, it's important to focus upon the nuance of syntax here. Not God is truthful. God is truth, which prompts our tradition that, as it were, the seal of God is truth. So when God indwells in Jerusalem, inevitably, Jerusalem is the city of truth because it's the city of God. And this theme of truth, and this is really what I wanted to note with respect to Zechariah chapter 8, this theme of truth is on manifold planes a recurrent one in Zechariah chapter 8. That is, when we consider verse 8, I think that's the last verse that we touched upon here. This is God's promise of restoration. I will bring them, referring to the ingathered of all those, my people, who have been dispersed in the east and the west. I will bring them in, and they will dwell in the midst of Jerusalem, and they will be my people, and I will be their God in truth and in righteousness. In truth. And that principle of truth is one that continues to be recurrent in what lies ahead when God describes, after all of the travail that was taking place at the time, what will be in the wake of the consecration of God's house. We read in verse 16, these are the things you shall do. Speak every man truth to his neighbor. Execute the judgment of truth and peace in your gates. And of course, let none of you devise evil in your hearts against his neighbor. Love no false oath. These are things I hate, says the Lord. This focus again upon truth. Significantly, truth that is conjoined with peace. And finally, the culmination of it all, the verse to which we return once again, since the fast of the fifth is front and center in our minds right now. Verse 19, thus says the Lord of hosts, the fast of the fourth month and the fast of the fifth and the fast of the seventh, the fast of the 10th shall become times of joy and gladness and cheerful feasts to the house of Judah. That part, I think we've already discussed at fairly great length. But then in the Hebrew, there are another 3 words. And love, truth, and peace. Truth and peace. Again, in the same vein that we encountered the conjoining of truth and peace in verse 16, execute the judgment of truth and peace. It's not only there. You know, what inevitably comes to mind in this conjoining of truth and peace, I think first and foremost, is Jeremiah chapter 33. We discussed Jeremiah chapter 33. Jeremiah is, we tend to think of him as such a prophet of gloom and doom that, goodness, in English, there is an actual word, Jeremiad, which describes a moaning and groaning song. lamentation. And of course, there is an awful lot of gloom and doom in Jeremiah. Chapter 33 is not gloom and doom. Chapter 33 is consolation. And in verse 6, behold, I will bring it, referring to Jerusalem, healing and cure, and I will cure them, and I will reveal unto them the abundance of peace and truth. One almost can't help but envision that when Zechariah is sharing these words with his contemporaries, talking about loving truth and peace, maybe even said to them, you remember Jeremiah? You remember his words of consolation? I will reveal unto them the abundance of peace and truth. It's happening. These days of mourning, these days of fasting are being transformed into days of joy and gladness. Love, truth, and peace. Exactly that pairing together that God said, I will reveal in abundance when I bring Jerusalem healing and cure, and I cure them.
Yeah, and maybe I'm off base here, but in Christianity, we feel like one of the names of God is love. Like the definition of love is God. And so in its own way, from my perspective, when I hear love, which I understand it's a verb there, that love, peace, and truth are three descriptions of who God is.
That's an interesting proposition.
Is there any place that where in your tradition they feel like God is love? Is that an accurate statement from your perspective?
So again, I would still be more inclined to say we describe God as loving. This is, to be very precise, the manner in which we describe God in terms of an attribute that we discern in our interpersonal affairs, that which we would identify as an act of love by a human being, when we see it with its source in God, motivates us to refer to God as loving. But with respect to truth and peace, there's an additional dimension. With respect to truth, well, we already noted Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 10. God the Lord is truth. That's an identity. It's an identity description. With respect to peace, we relate to the word shalom as a holy name of God. That even has practical ramifications. If a person is in an unclean location, it is unseemly to utter God's name. And it is likewise forbidden to say shalom, because it's considered to be an affront to say God's name in an unclean place. And shalom is the name of God.
I did not know that.
There are those who are very strict in written correspondence to avoid writing a name of God, because written correspondence, the letter isn't going to last forever and people are going to toss it out eventually, and that's disrespectful. There are, I should note, those who, as a matter of proper practice, bid people to avoid signing a letter in French, adieu. Because what does adieu mean? Literally, it means with God. Well, if that letter is going to be tossed out, then you've tossed out with God. And
it was one of the first things I noted when I came to have the Shabbat celebration with you was when you handed out the literature, you said, either give this back to me or promise me you won't throw it out. And I can show you right where it is in my house because I've never thrown it out, because you said, don't throw this out because it has God's infallible name. And also it reminds me that I've heard that the book of Esther, when Mordecai wrote it, the reason he specifically didn't use the name of God in that book was for that very reason, that he didn't want, because he knew it was a letter that was going out to all of the provinces. He didn't want his name to be. Have you ever heard that?
Well, I mean, I think there are more sublime reasons that God's name doesn't appear in the book of Esther. That's something we'll have to talk about when we get to Purim.
Okay. All right. So, but no doubt.
But in any case, certainly truth and peace are both names of God. And we were speaking before, and I just want to reiterate the point that we discussed earlier, and that is that they're both connected to Jerusalem. Again, the first name of Jerusalem in the Bible, Melchizedek.
He calls it Salem, is what we would, and seeing that I live in Winston-Salem.
I don't know where Winston comes from in the Bible. I'm not so sure about that, but
not in
Salem
there.
definitely.
It comes from the English people. The original settlement was Salem by the Moravians, and then the people that came from England came over and started the Winston part of it. And at one point in time, it merged to become Winston-Salem. But Old Salem, if you ever come to this area, is kind of like Jamestown in that they've completely rebuilt it into the way the Moravians originally had it laid out, with choirs and all these different, because they were highly devout people. Anyway, I relate definitely to the idea of Salem, because it's certainly used throughout, but there's only one actual Jerusalem, and there is that aspect of what we can all look forward to.
But of course, you'll excuse my pedantically stressing it's not Salem, it's Shalem.
Right. No, you're exactly right.
And of course, the reason that it's important for you to stress that is because Salem may be a place name, but it doesn't mean anything. Shalem is a place name, and it does mean something. Shalem is the Hebrew word for complete. That's the self-same root as shalom. Shalom, which we translate as peace, means completeness, which is an idea that I think speaks volumes with respect to what true peace signifies.
Especially when you add the word truth in there, right? Because it's the beginning and the end, and to some extent, I've always loved the in the 119th Psalm is thy word's true from the beginning, and your righteous judgments will last forever. In other words, it's at the end of the story, we will know the truth, not to mention anything that's not built on truth will crash and burn. And so we know that, the beauty of that is it's not only, like you said, another phrase, not only was it that, but it is that, and it will be that.
Okay, absolutely. And again, so when you consider the implications with respect to Jerusalem in particular, that is, and we've noted the first instance again is Melchizedek. This is in Genesis chapter 14, verse 18. And while again there isn't any indication at all in Genesis that it's Jerusalem, we know that it is. We know that it is because when we do an exhaustive survey of every single place in the Bible where we encounter Shalem as a place designation, again, not merely as a common noun referring to that which is complete, but as a place designation, well, there's only one other. And that one other is in Psalm 76, and in the style of biblical couplets, we discern in verse 3, In Shalem was his sukkah, his tabernacle, and in Zion his habitation. So just as the habitation and the tabernacle correspond to one another, Zion and Shalem correspond to one another. It's Jerusalem. And Jerusalem that provides us with its debut in the Bible as Shalem is ultimately designated as the city of truth in these words of Zechariah. I feel compelled to append to this, just as an additional thought. I must admit, this additional thought just struck me as we're speaking right now, that when we consider the implications with respect to how we call Jerusalem, what's the very last thought that we read in the book of Ezekiel? The name of the city, and it's also referring to Jerusalem, from that day shall be, the Lord is there. God's name is the name of Jerusalem. The Lord is there. And how do we find that manifest? Well, of course, truth, peace. The Lord is there.
Yeah, and as you were just describing it, I got this picture, is that psalm referred to is God's tabernacle. That it's not just that the high priest that day will be in the Holy of Holies, but to some extent, if we're all in his presence. I don't know how it works, but I know that, oh my goodness, to actually dwell with God, to actually be in his tabernacle, or to tabernacle with him, as you guys have a feast about this whole thing.
Well, but of course, we've already noted Isaiah chapter 56. My house will be called the house of prayer for all peoples.
Right.
So we know that's where we're heading. That's the destination for all of humanity. And inevitably, where I'd like to head, whether we can head there today, or we should see this as a cliffhanger to further explore next time, I'll leave to your discretion, Pastor Harvey. When we consider this conjoining again of truth and peace, there's another passage in the Bible that comes to mind where truth and peace both appear together with two other attributes: kindness and righteousness. I'm referring to Psalm 85, verse 11, which we can translate as kindness and truth are met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other.
Yes, well, I wish we did have time, because that seems like it's rich ground to explore.
So this is going to inevitably entail a process, which after all is what life is all about, right? It's a process. We are the walking ones.
Right. And you can't help but note immediately that, as we Christians would call sanctification, and this idea of, growing in our relationship with God, that those concepts being knitted together are more than spectacular, as unfortunately, in my earlier years, I think those two pieces of me were so far apart that not even, and so the idea that those being knitted together. Wow. Wow. I can hardly wait. That will be a journey. And we also never got to Isaiah 40 as we take twists and turns. So 2 cliffhangers for you.
Okay. So what we'll just note is that think of kindness and truth and righteousness and peace as 4 gauges. We have an ancient tradition that these 4 gauges are essential gauges of the human condition. To what extent do these gauges justify what we're doing here?
Wow. I like that.
And again,
Especially
it's
since I'm
process.
a Christian car guy. I like gauges. Gauges are something I understand.
Well, we need gauges after all. We need to have some sense of,
Yeah.
well, between where we started out and where we're heading, where are we?
If we're running on empty. All right. Well, I can hardly wait for next week. And this has been such a joy as always. I learned so much. I can't even believe how much I learned.
That's Robby. Yeah, it only happens thanks to you, and I'm everlasting grateful for the opportunity for us to share together.
Well, shalom, my friend.
Shalom, shalom. From the city of truth and the city of peace.
Amen.